In 1855, a 16-year-old boy walked the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, searching for work. He owned nothing but a borrowed suit and a small leather notebook in which he recorded every penny he earned and every penny he spent. Within 4 decades, that same boy would amass a personal fortune worth over $400 billion in today's money, making him the richest individual who has ever lived. His name would become synonymous with both extraordinary generosity and ruthless ambition. But the story behind that name is far stranger than most people realize. The Cleveland that young John Davison Rockefeller entered in the autumn of 1855 was a city on the verge of transformation. Situated on the southern shore of Lake Erie, it had grown from a modest frontier settlement into a bustling commercial hub of roughly 40,000 people. Railroads were stitching the American heartland together at a furious pace, and Cleveland sat at a critical junction between the agricultural wealth of the Midwest and the industrial appetite of the East Coast. It was a city where fortunes could be made by anyone with enough nerve and enough discipline. And the teenage boy who arrived there with almost nothing in his pockets possessed both qualities in extraordinary measure. John D. Rockefeller had been born on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York, nestled in the rolling hills about 200 miles northwest of New York City, roughly the distance from Philadelphia to Boston. His family was neither prominent nor prosperous. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was a devout Baptist woman of Scottish-Irish descent, stern and deeply pious, who held the household together through sheer force of will. She raised her children on Scripture, prayer, and an unshakable belief that hard work and moral discipline were the only reliable paths to a decent life. In many ways, her influence would echo through every decision her son ever made, from the boardroom to the church pew. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was an altogether different kind of figure. Known locally as Big Bill and later as Devil Bill, he was a tall, charismatic con man who traveled the countryside selling patent medicines and dubious elixirs to unsuspecting farmers. He would disappear for months at a time, leaving Eliza and the children to fend for themselves on the family's modest farm. Big Bill was a gambler, a schemer, and by many accounts a bigamist who eventually married a second woman under a false name, while his first family still waited for him to come home. He once boasted to a neighbor that he cheated his own sons whenever he could, explaining that he wanted to make them sharp. The contrast between his parents could hardly have been more extreme. On one side stood a woman of unwavering religious conviction and moral rigidity. On the other stood a man who treated honesty as an obstacle to be overcome. Young John absorbed lessons from both. The family moved several times during his childhood, drifting through small towns in upstate New York and eventually settling near Cleveland. Money was always scarce when Big Bill was away, which was often. John learned early that the world did not reward the careless or the idle. He took odd jobs as a boy, raising turkeys, digging potatoes for neighboring farmers, and lending his small savings to a local farmer at 7% interest when he was just 12 years old. That detail, trivial as it might seem, revealed something fundamental about his character. While other boys his age were fishing or playing in the fields, John Davison Rockefeller was already thinking about how money could be made to multiply. When the family relocated to the Cleveland area in 1853, John enrolled at Central High School, where he proved to be a competent but unremarkable student. He showed no particular brilliance in literature or science. What he did show was an almost preternatural aptitude for arithmetic and a quiet, focused intensity that his classmates found difficult to read. He was not popular in the conventional sense. He did not joke easily or seek attention. But those who knew him recognized a young man who seemed older than his years, composed and deliberate in a way that set him apart from the boisterous energy of mid-century American adolescence. At 16, Rockefeller decided that further schooling was a luxury he could not afford. He completed a brief course in bookkeeping at Folsom's Commercial College and then set out to find employment. For 6 weeks, he walked the streets of Cleveland, visiting every office, warehouse, and counting house he could find. Methodically knocking on doors and offering his services, he would later recall those weeks of searching as one of the defining periods of his life. On September 26, 1855, a date he would celebrate for the rest of his days with the same reverence most Americans reserve for the 4th of July, he was finally hired as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a small commission merchant and produce shipping firm near the Cleveland docks. His starting wage was modest, roughly 50 cents a day, the equivalent of about $18 in modern terms. But from that very first paycheck, he set aside a portion for the Baptist church and another portion for savings. The little leather notebook he had carried since boyhood now became a sacred ledger. He called it Ledger A, and in it he tracked every transaction with the meticulous devotion of a monk transcribing scripture. No sum was too small to record, no expense was too trivial to question. It was a habit that would stay with him for the rest of his life, long after the sums in question had grown from pennies to millions. Who was this young man, really? Where did that extraordinary discipline come from? Was it his mother's Baptist faith, burned into his conscience before he could walk? Was it his father's betrayals, teaching him that the only person he could truly rely on was himself? Was it the poverty of his childhood, sharpening his hunger into something that could never quite be satisfied? Or was it something else entirely, some rare and inexplicable combination of temperament and timing that placed the right person in the right country at precisely the right moment in history? This is the story of the Rockefeller Dynasty, the family that rose from rural obscurity to become the wealthiest and most influential clan in American history. It is a story of oil and money, of monopoly and philanthropy, of faith and ruthlessness intertwined so tightly that even now, more than a century later, historians still argue over where one ends and the other begins. It begins not in the marble halls of power, but in a drafty office on the Cleveland waterfront, where a teenage bookkeeper opened his ledger and began to count. The world that John D. Rockefeller entered as a young bookkeeper in the late 1850s was a world still largely powered by whale oil, tallow candles, and coal gas. The streets of American cities were dim after sundown, and the vast interior of the continent remained cloaked in darkness once the sun dipped below the horizon. Kerosene existed, but it was expensive and unreliable. The average American household spent more on illumination relative to income than a modern family spends on electricity. Light, in the most literal sense, was a luxury. That was about to change in ways that no one, not even the most far-sighted visionary, could have predicted. On August 27, 1859, a retired railroad conductor named Edwin Drake struck oil near Titusville, Pennsylvania, at a depth of just 69 feet. The well produced roughly 25 barrels a day, a modest quantity by later standards, but the news spread across the country like wildfire. Within months, thousands of speculators, drifters, and fortune seekers descended upon the forests of northwestern Pennsylvania, transforming a quiet stretch of farmland and timber country into one of the most chaotic boomtowns the nation had ever seen. The scene resembled the California gold rush of a decade earlier, except that the treasure being pulled from the earth was not glittering metal but a dark, foul-smelling liquid that most people had previously regarded as a nuisance. They called it black gold, and for good reason. A single barrel of crude oil, refined into kerosene, could light a home for weeks at a fraction of the cost of whale oil. The demand was immediate, enormous, and growing by the day. Rockefeller, still in his early 20s and working as a commission merchant in Cleveland, watched the oil frenzy with a mixture of fascination and caution. He visited the Pennsylvania oil fields in 1860 and came away unimpressed by the chaos he witnessed. Men were drilling wells haphazardly, flooding the market with crude, and then watching helplessly as prices collapsed from $20 a barrel to 10 cents in the space of a few months. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. The boom and bust cycle was savage and relentless. Rockefeller, who had spent his entire young life cultivating order and discipline, saw in this disorder not a reason to stay away but an opportunity of staggering proportions. The key insight, the one that would separate him from every other ambitious young man watching the oil fields, was deceptively simple. He decided that the real money was not in pulling crude oil out of the ground. The real money was in refining it. Before tracing the next steps of that fateful decision, it is worth pausing to consider the name itself. The surname Rockefeller is of German origin, derived from the village of Rockenfeld in the Rhineland region of what is now Western Germany. The family's ancestors had emigrated to colonial America in the early 18th century, settling in New Jersey and later moving to upstate New York. The name, loosely translated, refers to a rocky field, an apt metaphor for a family that would build its empire by extracting wealth from the most unpromising ground. By the time John D. was born, the Rockefellers had been in America for over a century, but they remained firmly in the lower rungs of society. There was no inherited wealth, no family connections, no old money lineage to smooth the path. Everything that followed would be built from scratch. The timing of Rockefeller's entry into the oil business coincided with one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. The Civil War had erupted in 1861, tearing the nation apart and consuming hundreds of thousands of lives. While young men his age were marching off to fight at Shiloh and Antietam, Rockefeller hired a substitute to serve in his place, a common and perfectly legal practice at the time for those who could afford the $300 fee, roughly $11,000 today. It was a decision that haunted his reputation for decades, though he was far from alone in making it. The war, for all its horror, created enormous demand for petroleum products. Kerosene lit army camps. Lubricants kept the machinery of war running. And the federal government's need for revenue led to new taxes and tariffs that reshaped the economic landscape in ways that favored industrialists willing to think on a national scale. In 1863, Rockefeller and a partner named Maurice Clark invested in an oil refinery on the banks of Kingsbury Run, a creek flowing through the industrial flats of Cleveland. The refinery was managed by a skilled English chemist named Samuel Andrews, who had developed a process for producing a cleaner, more reliable grade of kerosene than most competitors could offer. The partnership proved profitable almost immediately. Cleveland's location gave it a decisive advantage over the oil regions of Pennsylvania. Situated at the crossroads of major rail lines and the Great Lakes shipping routes, the city could receive crude oil cheaply and ship refined products to markets across the country and overseas with remarkable efficiency. Rockefeller recognized this geographic advantage and exploited it with ruthless precision. By 1865, the partnership had become one of the largest refineries in Cleveland, but Rockefeller wanted more. He bought out Maurice Clark and his brothers in a tense auction in February of that year, paying $72,500, a sum equivalent to roughly $1.5 million today, for full control of the business. It was a bold gamble for a man not yet 26 years old, but Rockefeller had done his arithmetic. He knew the numbers better than anyone, and the numbers told him that the oil refining business, if managed with sufficient discipline and scale, could generate profits beyond anything Cleveland had ever seen. Over the next 5 years he expanded relentlessly. He borrowed heavily, reinvested every available dollar, and cultivated relationships with bankers and railroad executives who could give him favorable terms. He brought in new partners, including Henry Flagler, a shrewd and aggressive businessman who would become his most trusted lieutenant for decades. Together they streamlined operations, cut waste, and drove down costs with an obsessive attention to detail that their competitors found baffling and increasingly terrifying. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller, Flagler, and their associates formally incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with a capitalization of $1 million. The name itself was chosen deliberately. Standard referred to the uniform quality of their refined kerosene, a product so consistent and reliable that customers could trust it without question. It was a small word, but it carried an enormous promise. Within a decade, that promise would reshape not just the oil industry, but the entire structure of American capitalism. The age of the monopoly was about to begin. The incorporation of Standard Oil in January 1870 was not, in itself, an extraordinary event. Dozens of oil refining companies operated in Cleveland alone, and hundreds more were scattered across Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. What made Standard Oil different was not its size at the moment of its founding, but the mind behind it. John D. Rockefeller did not merely want to compete in the oil refining business. He wanted to control it entirely. And he pursued that goal with a methodical intensity that the American economy had never before encountered. The first and most decisive weapon in Rockefeller's arsenal was the railroad rebate. In the 1870s, railroads were the arteries of American commerce. Every barrel of crude oil that moved from the Pennsylvania fields to the refineries, and every barrel of refined kerosene that moved from the refineries to the consumer, traveled by rail. The published shipping rates were theoretically the same for all customers, but in practice, the railroad companies were desperate for guaranteed, high-volume freight. Rockefeller understood this desperation and exploited it brilliantly. He approached the major rail lines, the Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, and offered them a straightforward bargain. Standard Oil would guarantee a fixed volume of shipments every single day, eliminating the uncertainty that plagued the railroad's planning. In exchange, Standard Oil would receive a secret discount on every barrel shipped, a rebate that its competitors would never know about and could never match. The impact was devastating. A small refiner shipping a few hundred barrels a week might pay the full published rate of, say, $2 a barrel. Standard Oil, shipping thousands of barrels daily, might pay 80 cents for the same journey. The math was merciless. Even if the smaller refiner matched Standard Oil in efficiency, in the quality of its kerosene, in the skill of its workers, it could not overcome a cost advantage of that magnitude. Rockefeller was not simply outcompeting his rivals. He was making it structurally impossible for them to survive. In 1872, this strategy took on an even more aggressive form through the South Improvement Company, a scheme so audacious that it would become one of the most infamous episodes in the history of American business. The South Improvement Company was a secret alliance between Standard Oil, several other large refiners, and three major railroad companies. Under the terms of the agreement, the participating refiners would receive not only rebates on their own shipments but also drawbacks, meaning a portion of the shipping fees paid by their competitors. In other words, every time an independent refiner shipped a barrel of oil, a fraction of the cost went directly into the pockets of Standard Oil and its allies. It was, by any reasonable definition, a conspiracy to destroy competition through collusion rather than through superior performance. When the details of the South Improvement Company leaked to the public in early 1872, the reaction was furious. Independent oil producers in Pennsylvania organized a boycott, refusing to sell crude to any refiner associated with the scheme. Newspapers denounced the arrangement as a monstrous assault on free enterprise. The Pennsylvania state legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter within months, and the railroads, embarrassed by the public outcry, formally canceled the agreements. Rockefeller himself never expressed any public remorse over the affair. He maintained then and for the rest of his life that the arrangement had been a legitimate business strategy designed to bring order to a chaotic and wasteful industry. Whether one accepts that justification or rejects it as self-serving rationalization remains one of the great debates of American economic history. What is beyond debate is that the South Improvement Company, even in failure, achieved much of what Rockefeller had intended. The mere threat of its existence terrified independent refiners across Cleveland and beyond. In a campaign that later became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller approached his competitors one by one during the first 3 months of 1872 and offered them a choice. They could sell their refineries to Standard Oil at a price Rockefeller deemed fair, or they could continue to operate independently and face certain ruin when the rebate system crushed their margins to nothing. Most of them sold. In the space of roughly 6 weeks, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of its 26 competitors in Cleveland. Some owner accepted Standard Oil stock in exchange, a decision that would eventually make them wealthy beyond their wildest expectations. Others took cash and walked away bitter and broken. A few held out, but their resistance was short-lived. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. To put that figure in perspective, no single company in American history, before or since, has achieved such total dominance over an essential industry. The equivalent today would be a single corporation controlling 90% of all internet service, or 90% of all electricity generation, or 90% of all smartphone production. The scale of the monopoly was almost incomprehensible, and it extended far beyond refining. Standard Oil controlled pipelines, barrel-making operations, railroad terminal facilities, and even the wagons that delivered kerosene to the homes of ordinary Americans. Rockefeller had not merely built a company. He had built a machine, a vast interlocking system designed to eliminate inefficiency, crush competition, and channel the maximum possible share of the nation's oil wealth into the hands of a single organization. The methods by which this machine operated were not always visible to the public. Standard Oil employed a network of informants, corporate spies, and front companies to monitor competitors and manipulate markets. Independent refiners who refused to sell would find their supply of crude oil mysteriously cut off, their railroad cars delayed or rerouted, their customers approached by Standard Oil salesmen offering kerosene at prices below the cost of production. These predatory pricing tactics were designed not to generate profit in the short term, but to bankrupt the competition. Once the independent was driven out of business, Standard Oil would raise prices again and absorb the abandoned market share. It was a strategy of suffocation, patient and methodical, and almost impossible to resist. Rockefeller himself rarely raised his voice or displayed visible emotion during these campaigns. Associates described him as calm, courteous, and unfailingly polite, even when delivering an ultimatum that would destroy a man's livelihood. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and made his decisions with the cold precision of an accountant balancing a ledger. He did not see himself as a predator. He saw himself as a rational man imposing order on an irrational world. The oil industry, in his view, was plagued by overproduction, ruinous price wars, and wasteful duplication. His monopoly, he believed, was not merely profitable but necessary. It was, in his own words, the salvation of an industry that would otherwise destroy itself. Whether the thousands of competitors he consumed along the way would have agreed with that assessment is another question entirely. To understand John D. Rockefeller solely through the lens of his business empire is to see only half the man. Behind the cold strategist who dismantled competitors with surgical precision stood a figure of deep and genuine religious conviction, a man who tithed faithfully from his very first paycheck, who taught Sunday school for decades, and who believed with absolute sincerity that his wealth was a gift from God. This was not a pose adopted for public consumption. It was the bedrock of his identity, planted in childhood and never abandoned, even as the fortune he accumulated grew to proportions that would have staggered the prophets he so admired. Rockefeller's faith was rooted in the Northern Baptist tradition, a branch of Protestant Christianity that emphasized personal salvation, moral discipline, and the stewardship of earthly blessings. His mother, Eliza, had raised him on scripture and prayer, and the lessons took hold with a tenacity that nothing in his later life could shake. From the age of 16, when he earned his first wages at Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller gave a fixed percentage of his income to the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church in Cleveland. The entries in Ledger A confirm this with the same meticulous precision that tracked his business expenditures. 6 cents to the Baptist Church, 10 cents to the Sunday school, 5 cents to the poor fund. The amounts were trivial, but the habit was iron. As his income grew from hundreds to thousands to millions, the donations grew in proportion, but the principle never changed. God had blessed him, and he was obligated to return a share of that blessing to the world. What made this faith so remarkable and so troubling to his critics was its coexistence with business practices that many observers considered morally indefensible. How could a man who prayed every morning and read scripture every evening also orchestrate the destruction of hundreds of small businesses? How could a devout churchgoer employ corporate spies, manipulate railroad rates, and drive families into bankruptcy without apparent remorse? These questions haunted Rockefeller's public image for his entire life, and they have never been satisfactorily answered. The most honest assessment is probably the simplest one. Rockefeller did not experience a contradiction because, in his own mind, there was none. He believed that the consolidation of the oil industry was a divinely ordained mission, that God had given him the talent and the opportunity to bring order out of chaos, and that the suffering of his competitors was an unfortunate but necessary consequence of a greater good. It was a theology of capitalism, and he held to it with the same unshakable certainty that he held to the Nicene Creed. His private life reflected these convictions with a consistency that even his harshest critics rarely questioned. In 1864, at the age of 25, he married Laura Celestia Spellman, a young woman from a prominent abolitionist family in Cleveland. Laura, known to her husband as Seti, was as serious and devout as he was. She had been educated at Ored Collegiate Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts, one of the few institutions of higher learning open to women at the time, and she shared her husband's commitment to temperance, moral reform, and the Baptist faith. Their courtship had been sober and deliberate, conducted largely through church social events and carefully chaperoned visits. There was no scandal, no passion in the romantic sense, and no deviation from the strict moral code that both families expected. It was, by all accounts, a partnership built on shared values rather than romantic fervor, and it endured without serious disruption for over 50 years until Laura's death in 1915. Together they raised 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. The household on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, and later the grand estate at Pocantico Hills in the Hudson Valley of New York, operated according to rules that would have seemed austere even by the standards of the late 19th century. The children were given modest allowances and required to keep detailed account books, just as their father had done since boyhood. They earned pennies for pulling weeds in the garden and were fined for minor infractions like tardiness at meals. Rockefeller wanted his children to understand the value of money, not merely its power. He had seen too many wealthy families ruined by indulgent heirs who squandered fortunes they had never earned, and he was determined that his own children would not follow that path. The discipline was strict, but by the standards of the Gilded Age, when the children of other magnates were racing yachts and hosting lavish parties in Newport, the Rockefeller household was remarkably restrained. This austerity extended to Rockefeller's personal habits as well. Unlike many of his fellow industrialists, men like Andrew Carnegie, Jay Gould, or J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller did not drink, did not smoke, did not gamble, and showed little interest in the conspicuous displays of wealth that defined the era. He did not collect European art or throw extravagant banquets. He did not maintain a private railroad car or a fleet of carriages beyond what was practically necessary. His pleasures were modest and predictable. He enjoyed golf, ice skating on the private pond at Pocantico Hills, and driving his horse-drawn carriage along the country roads of Westchester County. He was known to hand out shiny new dimes to children and strangers he met on his walks, a habit that became one of the most enduring images of his later years. The dimes were not given as a display of wealth, but as a small, deliberate gesture of connection. A reminder, perhaps, of the pennies he himself had once counted so carefully. Yet this portrait of domestic modesty existed alongside a fortune of almost incomprehensible scale. By the 1890s, Rockefeller's personal wealth exceeded that of the United States federal government. His annual income was measured not in thousands or even millions, but in tens of millions of dollars, at a time when the average American worker earned roughly $500 a year. The gap between Rockefeller and an ordinary citizen was proportionally far greater than the gap between any modern billionaire and a middle-class American today. He was not merely rich. He occupied a category of wealth that had never before existed in human history, and he managed this contradiction, the devout Baptist who controlled more money than most nations, with a composure that struck some observers as saintly and others as deeply unsettling. The tension between his faith and his fortune was not lost on the American public. Newspapers lampooned him as a hypocrite, a man who praised God on Sunday and crushed widows on Monday. Ministers debated whether his philanthropy was genuine charity or merely the guilty conscience of a robber baron buying his way into heaven. Rockefeller himself seemed largely unbothered by these attacks. He rarely responded to the press, rarely defended himself in public, and maintained a silence that his enemies interpreted as arrogance and his admirers interpreted as dignity. In his private correspondence, he returned again and again to the same simple conviction. God had given him the ability to make money, and God expected him to use that ability for the betterment of mankind. Whether the world believed him was, in the final analysis, between him and his creator. For more than 3 decades, John D. Rockefeller had built his empire largely in the shadows. Standard Oil operated through a labyrinth of subsidiary companies, holding trusts, and interlocking directorates that made it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand how the organization actually functioned. The public knew that Rockefeller was extraordinarily wealthy. They knew that Standard Oil dominated the kerosene market, but the precise mechanisms of that dominance, the rebates, the drawbacks, the predatory pricing, the espionage, remained obscure to most Americans. That veil of secrecy was about to be torn apart by a woman with a typewriter, a grievance, and an investigative tenacity that would change the course of American journalism forever. Ida Minerva Tarbell was born in 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania, in the heart of the oil regions that Rockefeller's empire had consumed. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, had been an independent oil producer and barrel maker who watched helplessly as Standard Oil's machinations destroyed his livelihood and the livelihoods of his neighbors. The trauma of that experience left a deep mark on the family, and young Ida grew up with a first-hand understanding of what monopoly power looked like from the losing side. She was brilliant, relentless, and possessed of a quiet fury that she channeled not into polemic but into meticulous, fact-based reporting. After establishing herself as a respected journalist and biographer, she turned her attention to the company that had haunted her childhood. The result would become one of the most consequential works of journalism in American history. Beginning in November 1902, McClure's magazine published the first installment of Tarbell's series, The History of the Standard Oil Company. Over the next 2 years, 19 installments appeared, each one more damning than the last. Tarbell had spent years gathering evidence, interviewing former employees, reviewing court records, and piecing together the hidden architecture of Rockefeller's monopoly. She documented the secret railroad rebates in painstaking detail. She traced the front companies and shell corporations that Standard Oil used to disguise its operations. She told the stories of individual businessmen who had been crushed by tactics they never saw coming. The writing was calm, precise, and devastating. Tarbell did not rant or moralize. She simply presented the facts, one after another, in a sequence so methodical and so thoroughly documented that denial was virtually impossible. The impact of the series was immediate and enormous. It arrived at a moment when the American public was growing increasingly uneasy about the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few industrial titans. The Gilded Age had produced staggering wealth for men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan, but it had also produced urban poverty, labor unrest, and a widening gap between the rich and everyone else that struck many Americans as fundamentally incompatible with democratic values. Tarbell's work gave that unease a specific target and a mountain of evidence to support it. She was not the only journalist of her era pursuing such stories. Lincoln Steffens was exposing municipal corruption. Upton Sinclair would soon publish The Jungle, his searing account of conditions in the Chicago meatpacking industry. Together, these writers formed the movement that President Theodore Roosevelt famously labeled muckrakers, borrowing a term from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress to describe journalists who raked through the muck of American society in search of the truth beneath it. Roosevelt himself was no passive observer. A progressive Republican who believed that unchecked corporate power threatened the Republic, he made trust-busting a centerpiece of his presidency. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey, the holding company that served as the nerve center of Rockefeller's empire, charging it with violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The case wound its way through the courts for 5 years, generating thousands of pages of testimony and legal argument. Rockefeller himself was called to testify before congressional committees, where he delivered answers so evasive and so carefully hedged that they became legendary examples of corporate obfuscation. When asked pointed questions about Standard Oil's practices, he would often respond with a gentle smile and the phrase, "I don't recall," a formulation that infuriated his interrogators and delighted editorial cartoonists. On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered its verdict. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that Standard Oil constituted an unreasonable restraint of trade and ordered the company dissolved into 34 independent entities. It was the most significant antitrust ruling in American history up to that point, and it sent shockwaves through the business world. The great monopoly, the machine that Rockefeller had spent 40 years constructing, was broken apart by the stroke of a judicial pen. And then something remarkable happened, something that no one, perhaps not even Rockefeller himself, had fully anticipated. The breakup of Standard Oil, far from diminishing his wealth, actually increased it beyond all previous measure. Each of the 34 successor companies received its own stock, and Rockefeller held substantial shares in every single one of them. As the individual companies competed and grew in the booming oil market of the early 20th century, the combined value of those shares skyrocketed. Companies that emerged from the dissolution, entities that would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and other giants of the modern petroleum industry saw their stock prices surge in the years following the breakup. Rockefeller, who had been extraordinarily rich before the Supreme Court ruling, became almost unimaginably wealthy afterward. By some estimates, his net worth peaked at roughly $900 million in the early 1910s, a sum equivalent to over $400 billion in today's money. To put that in perspective, it was more than double the current fortune of the wealthiest individuals alive today. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The government had set out to curb the power of a monopoly and had instead created the conditions for the monopolist to become even richer. Rockefeller, characteristically, said little in public about the ruling. In private, he is reported to have received the news calmly, turned to a companion, and remarked that the decision would ultimately benefit everyone, including the shareholders. Whether this was genuine equanimity or simply the confidence of a man who had already done the arithmetic remains an open question. What is certain is that the dissolution of Standard Oil marked a turning point not only in Rockefeller's personal history, but in the broader history of American capitalism. The federal government had demonstrated, for the first time on such a scale, that even the most powerful private enterprise was subject to the rule of law. The precedent set in 1911 would echo through the decades that followed, shaping antitrust policy and corporate regulation for generations to come. For Rockefeller, now in his early 70s, the ruling also marked a kind of liberation. The empire he had built and defended for so long was no longer his burden to carry. The legal battles, the public scrutiny, the constant pressure of managing the most hated corporation in America were behind him. What lay ahead was a final chapter that would prove, in its own way, just as consequential as everything that had come before. The question of what to do with an almost limitless fortune is not as simple as it might appear. History is littered with examples of wealthy men who hoarded their riches until death, leaving behind estates that were squandered by ungrateful heirs or seized by hostile governments. Others gave recklessly, scattering money across causes and institutions without strategy or accountability, achieving little of lasting value. John D. Rockefeller chose a different path, one that would ultimately reshape the very concept of philanthropy in the modern world. He did not simply give his money away. He engineered its distribution with the same methodical precision he had once applied to the destruction of his competitors. The roots of this philanthropic impulse stretched back, as so many things in Rockefeller's life did, to his childhood faith. The Baptist tradition taught that wealth was not an end in itself but a trust, a temporary stewardship granted by God for the betterment of humanity. Rockefeller took this teaching literally. From his earliest days as a bookkeeper, he had given a fixed portion of his income to the church and to charitable causes. As his wealth grew, so did his giving. But the scale of his fortune eventually outpaced his ability to distribute it wisely through personal donations alone. By the 1880s, he was receiving thousands of letters every month from individuals, churches, hospitals, and schools begging for financial assistance. The volume was overwhelming. He needed a system. The man who helped him build that system was Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister turned organizational strategist whom Rockefeller hired in 1891 as his chief philanthropic advisor. Gates was not a soft-hearted do-gooder. He was sharp, analytical, and deeply skeptical of sentimental charity. He believed that giving money to the poor without addressing the root causes of poverty was not generosity but waste. What he proposed instead was something he called scientific philanthropy, an approach that treated charitable giving as an investment, subject to the same rigorous analysis and accountability that any sound business venture would demand. Rockefeller, who had spent his career demanding efficiency in every aspect of his operations, found this philosophy deeply appealing. Together, they set about transforming American philanthropy from an act of individual charity into a professionalized, institutional enterprise. The first major fruit of this partnership was the University of Chicago, founded in 1890 with an initial gift of $600,000 from Rockefeller. The university was conceived not as a modest regional college, but as a world-class research institution that could rival Harvard, Yale, and the great universities of Europe. Over the next 2 decades, Rockefeller poured more than $35 million into the university, equivalent to roughly $1 billion today. He insisted on hiring the finest scholars, building state-of-the-art laboratories, and fostering an atmosphere of intellectual freedom that attracted talent from around the globe. The result was an institution that, within a single generation, became one of the most prestigious universities on Earth, a status it maintains to this day. Notably, Rockefeller never sought to control the university's curriculum or impose his own religious or political views on its faculty. He provided the money and trusted the scholars to use it wisely, a restraint that distinguished him from many other wealthy benefactors of the era. But it was in the field of public health that Rockefeller's philanthropy achieved its most dramatic and far-reaching impact. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, the first institution in the United States devoted entirely to biomedical research. Modeled on the great research institutes of Europe, particularly the Pasteur Institute in Paris and the Koch Institute in Berlin, it attracted some of the finest scientific minds of the age and produced breakthroughs that saved millions of lives. Researchers at the institute developed treatments for meningitis, identified the mechanism of blood types, and made fundamental contributions to the understanding of infectious disease. The institute, later renamed Rockefeller University, has produced more than 24 Nobel Prize laureates over the course of its history, a record that speaks for itself. Even more consequential, in terms of sheer human impact, was the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, established in 1909 with the specific mission of eradicating hookworm disease in the American South. Hookworm was a parasitic infection that afflicted millions of people across the southern states, causing chronic fatigue, anemia, stunted growth in children, and a general listlessness that outsiders often misattributed to laziness or moral failing. The disease thrived in areas with poor sanitation and was overwhelmingly concentrated among the rural poor. The Sanitary Commission funded treatment programs, built sanitary latrines, and conducted massive public health education campaigns across 11 southern states. Within a decade, hookworm infection rates plummeted, and the broader public health infrastructure that the Commission helped build laid the groundwork for modern disease control efforts throughout the region. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful public health interventions in American history, and it was funded almost entirely by a single man's fortune. In 1913, Rockefeller formalized the institutional framework for his giving by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation, with an initial endowment of $100 million, roughly $3 billion in today's terms. The foundation's charter was breathtakingly ambitious. Its stated mission was to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, and it pursued that mission with a global scope that was unprecedented for a private philanthropic organization. The foundation funded campaigns against yellow fever in Latin America, malaria in Asia, and tuberculosis in Europe. It supported agricultural research that contributed to the Green Revolution, helping to feed hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. It funded libraries, schools, and public health programs on every inhabited continent. By the time of Rockefeller's death, his total charitable contributions amounted to approximately $540 million, equivalent to roughly $11 billion today. It was the largest philanthropic legacy in American history up to that point, and its influence continues to shape institutions and policies around the world more than a century later. The comparison to modern philanthropy is inevitable and instructive. Today, figures like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and other signatories of the Giving Pledge are often described as following in Rockefeller's footsteps, and the comparison is not without merit. The Gates Foundation, in particular, with its focus on global health, scientific research, and data-driven giving, bears a striking resemblance to the model that Rockefeller and Frederick Gates pioneered over a century ago. But there is a crucial difference that is often overlooked. Rockefeller built his philanthropic infrastructure at a time when no model existed. There were no established foundations, no professional grant-making organizations, no academic departments studying the science of charitable giving. He and his advisors invented the template that every major philanthropist since has followed, whether consciously or not. Yet the question that shadowed Rockefeller's business career followed him into his philanthropic life as well. Was his generosity genuine, or was it merely a calculated effort to rehabilitate a tarnished reputation? The answer, as with so many things about this complicated man, resists simple categorization. The chronological record shows that Rockefeller began giving systematically long before his public image became a liability, long before Ida Tarbell, long before the antitrust suits, long before the newspaper cartoons depicting him as a grasping octopus strangling American enterprise. His philanthropy was not a reaction to criticism. It was a lifelong practice that grew in scale as his resources grew. Whether that settles the moral question is for each observer to decide. What cannot be disputed is the result. The institutions Rockefeller built and funded have touched the lives of hundreds of millions of people, curing diseases, educating scholars and advancing human knowledge on a scale that few governments, let alone private individuals, have ever matched. John Davison Rockefeller Jr. was born on January 29, 1874, the only son among 5 children and the heir to the most colossal fortune in American history. From the earliest days of his childhood, he was groomed for a burden that no young man could have been fully prepared to carry. His father raised him with the same austere discipline that governed the entire Rockefeller household: the account books, the modest allowances, the Sunday school lessons, the relentless emphasis on duty and stewardship. But where the elder Rockefeller had forged his character in the crucible of poverty and self-reliance, Junior grew up in the long shadow of a name that was already the most famous and the most hated in America. He was a quiet, slender, deeply earnest young man, prone to anxiety and self-doubt, who lacked his father's iron constitution and ruthless instinct for business. He once confided to a friend that the weight of his inheritance felt less like a blessing than a sentence. After graduating from Brown University in 1897, Junior entered his father's orbit at 26 Broadway, the legendary headquarters of Standard Oil in Lower Manhattan. He served on various corporate boards and began managing elements of the family's vast financial interests, but his temperament was ill-suited to the combative world of industrial capitalism. He was more comfortable in the church than in the boardroom, more drawn to questions of ethics and social responsibility than to the mechanics of profit and loss. His father, recognizing this, gradually shifted Junior's focus toward philanthropy, entrusting him with an ever larger role in the distribution of the family's charitable wealth. It was a transition that suited the younger man's disposition, but before he could fully embrace that role, he would first have to survive a crisis that nearly destroyed the Rockefeller name entirely. The crisis centered on a desolate stretch of scrubland in southern Colorado, where the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a corporation in which the Rockefeller family held a controlling interest, operated a network of coal mines. The conditions in those mines were appalling by any standard. Miners worked 10 to 12 hours a day in cramped, poorly ventilated tunnels for wages that barely covered the cost of living in the company-owned towns where they were required to reside. They bought their food at company stores, at inflated prices. They sent their children to company schools and worshipped in company churches. They were paid not in United States currency but in company scrip, redeemable only at those same company stores. The system was, in all but name, a form of economic servitude, and by the autumn of 1913, the miners had had enough. In September of that year, roughly 11,000 miners affiliated with the United Mine Workers of America went on strike, demanding recognition of their union, an 8-hour workday, fair wages paid in real currency, and the right to live and shop where they chose. The company evicted them from their homes almost immediately, and the miners and their families set up tent colonies on the open prairie, enduring the brutal Colorado winter in canvas shelters, while the company brought in strikebreakers and armed guards from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Tensions escalated steadily through the winter and into the spring. There were shootings, beatings, and confrontations along the picket lines. The governor of Colorado deployed the state militia ostensibly to keep order, but the militia's sympathies lay overwhelmingly with the mining company. On April 20, 1914, the situation exploded. National Guard troops, supported by company guards, attacked the largest tent colony at Ludlow, about 15 miles north of Trinidad, Colorado. They raked the camp with machine gun fire and then set the tents ablaze. When the smoke cleared, at least 25 people were dead, including 2 women and 11 children who had suffocated in a pit beneath one of the burning tents where they had taken shelter from the gunfire. The youngest victim was just 4 months old. The event became known as the Ludlow Massacre, and it ignited a firestorm of outrage across the nation. Armed miners launched retaliatory attacks on mine properties throughout southern Colorado, and the violence did not subside until federal troops were dispatched to restore order. By the time the conflict ended, estimates of the total death toll ranged from 69 to nearly 200, depending on the source. The public fury fell squarely on the Rockefeller family. Jr. had never visited the Colorado mines. He had relied entirely on the reports of company managers, who assured him that the miners were well treated and that the strike was the work of outside agitators. When he was called to testify before the United States Commission on Industrial Relations in 1915, his initial statements were defensive and tone-deaf. He insisted that the company had acted responsibly and that the miners' grievances were exaggerated. The reaction was savage. Newspapers branded him a murderer. Protesters gathered outside the family's offices in New York. The writer Upton Sinclair staged a dramatic picket outside 26 Broadway, and the socialist journalist Mother Jones called Jr. the most despised man in America. What happened next marked a turning point not only in Jr.'s life, but in the history of American labor relations. Shaken by the magnitude of the disaster and the ferocity of the public response, Jr. sought the counsel of Mackenzie King, a Canadian labor relations expert who would later become the Prime Minister of Canada. King persuaded Jr. to visit the Colorado mines in person, something no Rockefeller had ever done. In September 1915, Jr. traveled to Colorado and spent several weeks living among the miners, eating in their mess halls, descending into the shafts, and listening to their grievances face to face. He danced with miners' wives at a social gathering, an image that was captured by photographers and circulated widely. The visit was part genuine empathy and part carefully managed public relations, but its effect was transformative. Jr. returned to New York and implemented the Colorado Industrial Plan, an employee representation scheme that gave workers a formal mechanism for voicing complaints and negotiating conditions. Though it stopped short of recognizing an independent union, the plan was criticized by labor organizers as a company union designed to prevent real collective bargaining, and that criticism was not without merit. But it represented a significant shift from the absolute refusal to negotiate that had characterized the company's earlier stance, and it established a precedent for employee engagement that influenced corporate labor policies for decades. The Ludlow crisis fundamentally altered Jr.'s understanding of the responsibilities that came with his family's wealth. In the years that followed, he threw himself into philanthropic and civic projects with an energy and a vision that eventually rivaled his father's contributions. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, transforming a neglected collection of colonial-era buildings into a living museum of American history that has drawn millions of visitors since its opening. He donated the land on which the United Nations headquarters now stands in Manhattan, and he oversaw the construction of Rockefeller Center, the vast Art Deco complex in Midtown New York City that remains one of the most iconic architectural achievements of the 20th century. Built during the darkest years of the Great Depression, Rockefeller Center employed tens of thousands of workers at a time when unemployment in the United States exceeded 25%. It was both a monument to the family's wealth and, in a very real sense, an act of public service, a private investment that kept thousands of families from destitution. Jr. spent the rest of his long life working to transform the Rockefeller name from a symbol of ruthless monopoly into a byword for civic responsibility and cultural stewardship. Whether he fully succeeded is a matter of perspective. But there is no question that the quiet, anxious son who once trembled under the weight of his inheritance ultimately proved himself worthy of it, not by imitating his father's methods, but by finding a different way to wield the power that his father's methods had created. John D. Rockefeller Sr. died on May 23, 1937, at the age of 97, in his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, most of his rivals, and most of the controversies that had once made his name synonymous with unchecked corporate power. By the time of his passing, The fortune he had built had already been dispersed across a vast network of trusts, foundations, and family holdings, and the task of managing that legacy had fallen to a new generation. Junior had 5 sons and 1 daughter, and it was the 5 brothers, John D. Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, who would carry the Rockefeller name into the second half of the 20th century and imprint it upon the political, financial, and cultural life of the nation in ways that their grandfather could scarcely have imagined. The brothers were raised at Pocantico Hills, the sprawling family estate in Westchester County, New York, that overlooked the Hudson River like a private kingdom. Their upbringing, while materially privileged beyond the experience of virtually any other American family, was governed by the same ethic of discipline and stewardship that had defined the household since the days of Ledger A. Jr. imposed strict allowances, required his sons to keep account books, and instilled in each of them the conviction that their wealth was not a personal entitlement, but a public trust. Each brother was expected to find a sphere of influence and dedicate himself to it with the seriousness that the family name demanded. Remarkably, each of them did, though they chose paths so different from one another that the range of their collective influence is almost difficult to comprehend. John D. Rockefeller III, the eldest, was the quietest and in many ways the most traditionally philanthropic of the brothers. He devoted the bulk of his career to cultural and educational causes, founding the Asia Society, supporting Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York City, and championing the Population Council, an organization dedicated to research on global population growth. He was not a public figure in the way some of his brothers became, but his influence on the intersection of American philanthropy and international development was substantial and enduring. He died in an automobile accident in 1978, at the age of 72, and his passing received far less public attention than it deserved. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was, by contrast, the most visible and politically ambitious of the 5. Charismatic, energetic, and possessed of a personal magnetism that his grandfather had never sought and his father had never possessed, Nelson entered politics with the confidence of a man who believed that public service was not merely a duty but a destiny. He served as governor of New York for 15 years, from 1959 to 1973, during which he oversaw a massive expansion of the state's infrastructure, including the construction of the State University of New York system, one of the largest public university networks in the country. He ran for the Republican presidential nomination 3 times, in 1960, 1964, and 1968, and was defeated each time, largely because the conservative wing of the party viewed him as too liberal and too closely associated with the Eastern establishment that many grassroots Republicans distrusted. In 1974, President Gerald Ford appointed him Vice President of the United States following Richard Nixon's resignation, making Nelson the only Rockefeller to hold national office. It was the pinnacle of the family's political influence, and yet it carried a faint air of anticlimax. Nelson had wanted the presidency, not the vice presidency, and the distinction mattered to him deeply. He died suddenly of a heart attack in January 1979, under circumstances that generated considerable tabloid speculation and a degree of embarrassment that the family bore with characteristic silence. Lawrence Spelman Rockefeller carved out a different legacy entirely. A pioneer in venture capital investing, he was among the earliest backers of companies in the aviation and technology sectors, providing crucial early funding to Eastern Airlines and several firms that contributed to the post-war boom in American aerospace. But Lawrence's most enduring contribution lay in the field of conservation. He donated tens of thousands of acres of land to the National Park Service, including significant portions of what became Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming and Virgin Islands National Park in the Caribbean. At a time when environmental preservation was not yet the mainstream cause it would later become, Lawrence Rockefeller used his wealth and his influence to protect some of the most beautiful landscapes in America a legacy that millions of visitors continue to enjoy every year. Winthrop Rockefeller, the fourth brother, took perhaps the most unexpected path of all. After a turbulent youth that included a well-publicized divorce and a reputation for hard living that embarrassed the family, he relocated to Arkansas in the 1950s and reinvented himself as a cattle rancher, civic leader, and eventually a politician. In 1966, he was elected governor of Arkansas, becoming the first Republican to hold that office since Reconstruction, a remarkable achievement in a state that had been a Democratic stronghold for nearly a century. His tenure was marked by efforts to modernize the state's economy, improve its educational system, and advance racial integration at a time when much of the Deep South remained bitterly resistant to change. Winthrop died of cancer in 1973, and his contributions to Arkansas remain a point of pride in the state to this day. David Rockefeller, the youngest of the five brothers, was arguably the most globally influential. As chairman and chief executive of Chase Manhattan Bank, he became one of the most powerful figures in international finance, cultivating personal relationships with heads of state, foreign ministers, and business leaders on every continent. He met with Nikita Khrushchev, dined with Deng Xiaoping, and maintained a Rolodex that was said to contain the private contact information of virtually every significant political and economic figure on Earth. His influence extended far beyond banking. He co-founded the Trilateral Commission in 1973, a private organization that brought together leaders from North America, Europe, and Japan to discuss issues of global governance and economic cooperation. He was a driving force behind the Council on Foreign Relations and a tireless advocate for international engagement at a time when isolationist sentiments periodically resurfaced in American politics. David's global reach and his association with organizations like the Trilateral Commission also made him the focal point of conspiracy theories that have swirled around the Rockefeller name for decades. In certain corners of the political spectrum, both far left and far right, the Rockefellers are portrayed as shadowy puppet masters orchestrating world events from behind closed doors, engineering financial crises, manipulating governments, and pursuing a secret agenda of global domination. These theories have no credible evidentiary basis, but they persist with a tenacity that says more about the anxieties of the modern age than about the Rockefeller family itself. The sheer scale of the family's wealth and influence, spanning oil, banking, politics, philanthropy, and international diplomacy across multiple generations, creates a canvas broad enough for almost any narrative to be projected upon it. David himself addressed the conspiracy theories with characteristic dry humor in his memoirs, published in 2002, acknowledging that some people believed he was part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, and adding simply that the charge was untrue. What is true, and what no serious historian disputes, is that the five Rockefeller brothers collectively wielded a degree of influence over American life that no other family of their generation could match. They shaped the skyline of New York, the politics of the Republican Party, the conservation of American wilderness, the architecture of international finance, and the direction of global philanthropy. They did so not as elected officials answerable to voters, or as corporate executives answerable to shareholders, but as private citizens whose power derived almost entirely from the fortune that one man had accumulated 2 generations earlier. Whether that concentration of private influence is something to be admired or something to be feared is a question that Americans have been debating since the first barrel of Standard Oil kerosene rolled off the line in Cleveland. And it is a question that remains as relevant today as it was then. The story of the Rockefeller Dynasty begins with a teenager in a borrowed suit, walking the streets of Cleveland in search of his first job, and it stretches across nearly 2 centuries of American history to arrive at a legacy so vast and so deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation that it is almost impossible to imagine what the United States would look like without it. From a single entry in a leather-bound notebook, recording a few pennies earned and a few pennies saved, grew an empire of oil, money, and influence that reshaped the American economy, redefined the relationship between private wealth and public life, and raised questions about power, morality, and responsibility that remain as urgent today as they were when John D. Rockefeller first cornered the kerosene market in the 1870s. The numbers alone are staggering. At the peak of his wealth, Rockefeller Sr. controlled a fortune equivalent to more than $400 billion in today's currency, a sum greater than the gross domestic product of most nations on Earth. Standard Oil, at its zenith, refined 90% of all the oil in the United States and operated a network of pipelines, railroads, and distribution channels that touched virtually every household in the country. The Rockefeller Foundation, endowed with what would today be billions of dollars, funded medical research that eradicated diseases, built universities that educated generations of scholars, and supported agricultural programs that fed hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. The family produced a Vice President of the United States, multiple governors, international financiers, conservation pioneers, and cultural patrons whose contributions shaped institutions that millions of Americans interact with every day without ever thinking about the name behind them. But the numbers, impressive as they are, do not tell the whole story. Behind every statistic lies a human reality that is far more complex and far more troubling than any balance sheet can capture. The same fortune that funded the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was built on the ruins of hundreds of small businesses whose owners were given a choice between surrender and destruction. The same family that donated the land for the United Nations headquarters presided over a mining operation in Colorado where women and children were burned alive in their tents. The same patriarch who handed out shiny dimes to strangers on his afternoon walks employed corporate spies, manipulated railroad executives, and crushed competitors with a methodical ruthlessness that his Baptist faith somehow never troubled. The Rockefeller story is not a simple tale of good or evil. It is a story about the price of empire, the cost that is exacted not only from those who are conquered, but from those who do the conquering. John D. Rockefeller Sr. lived to the age of 97, long enough to see his name transformed from the most reviled in America to one of the most respected. He spent the last decades of his life playing golf, dispensing dimes, and watching his philanthropic investments bear fruit on a global scale. He never publicly expressed regret for the methods by which he had built his fortune, and there is no credible evidence that he privately harbored any. He went to his grave believing, as he had always believed, that God had chosen him for a purpose, and that he had fulfilled that purpose to the best of his ability. His son, Junior, spent a lifetime trying to cleanse the family name of the stain left by Standard Oil, and he largely succeeded, though the effort cost him his health and much of his peace of mind. The 5 brothers of the 3rd generation expanded the family's influence into politics, finance, conservation, and international diplomacy, achieving a collective reach that no American family has since equaled. And the generations that followed, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, have continued to manage the family's wealth and philanthropic interests, though with an increasingly low profile that reflects both the dilution of the fortune across dozens of heirs and a deliberate retreat from the public stage. The Rockefeller name today evokes a curious mixture of admiration and suspicion that is unique in American culture. Rockefeller Center still stands in the heart of Manhattan. Its Art Deco towers a monument to an era when private wealth could reshape the skyline of the greatest city on earth. Rockefeller University continues to produce Nobel laureates. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to fund programs in global health, education, and economic development. The family's conservation legacy endures in national parks that millions of Americans visit every year. And yet the conspiracy theories persist, the suspicion that behind every great fortune lies a great crime, as Balzac is often paraphrased as saying, and that the Rockefellers, more than any other family, embody the uncomfortable truth that the same ambition that builds hospitals can also destroy livelihoods, that the same discipline that creates institutions can also crush individuals, and that the line between visionary and predator is often drawn not by the person who crosses it, but by those who are left standing on the other side. The American dream, in its purest form, promises that anyone can rise from nothing to greatness through hard work, ingenuity, and moral character. No family in the history of the United States has embodied that promise more completely than the Rockefellers, and no family has illustrated its contradictions more vividly. John D. Rockefeller started with nothing and built more than any single individual in American history. He gave away more than any philanthropist before him. He also destroyed more competitors, accumulated more unchecked power, and provoked more public outrage than perhaps any private citizen the nation has ever produced. His descendants carried his legacy forward with a sense of duty and purpose that, whatever one thinks of its origins, cannot easily be dismissed. So the question remains, the same question that has followed the Rockefeller name through 6 generations and more than a century of American history. Was John D. Rockefeller the ultimate embodiment of the American dream? A self-made titan who used his God-given talents to build, to create, and to give on a scale the world had never seen? Or was he the ultimate cautionary tale? A man whose relentless pursuit of control came at a cost that no amount of philanthropy could ever fully repay. Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.